A million moons ago when I was young, my friends and I would watch the first 2 Die Hard movies every Christmas. At the risk of sounding like a hipster, we did it almost every year, before the sweaters and slogans. Many years before oversized coffee mugs were being manufactured with the statement that it is my Christmas movie. I have 2 of them. They were gifts, and they hold a hefty portion of ramen. There is another cinematic classic that never fails to get me in the Christmas mood, and that's Batman Returns. I know this isn't a profound statement, and I'm sure many of you feel the same way about Tim Burton's masterpiece sequel, but I feel it doesn't get talked about as much. It's a cold movie, perfectly dark, and wonderfully Burton through and through. Before the days where he relied on CGI, remaking classics, and succumbing to the Disney machine. I mean, yeah, he got his start with the company before he had a film career, but his early output was far more interesting than what it would eventually become. Batman was an extremely important experience for me back in the day, but its sequel was just as influential in my eyes. The casting was perfect, visually it was unique, and it managed to incorporate 3 villains into the story without ever feeling bloated. It was violent, disturbing, and moody, while still maintaining that classic comic book tone. Parents complained all over, and the machine was starting to clamp down on Burton. This inevitably caused the man to walk away from the director's chair. Keaton would eventually follow once he started seeing where the studio was taking the franchise. Despite the negative reactions and darker storyline, the flick was a massive success. Toys, foods, toys in the foods. Even McDonald's got their hands dirty by doling out bat toys with their bat foods. They were criticized for supporting the movie because whiny complainers had very few places they could be heard before the internet. It all seems quaint, but a perfect example of what Warner Brothers were and what Warner Brothers are to this day. Confused, greedy, and only interested in the bottom line. Either way, Batman returned and the merchandise was everywhere. Of course, there were video games, many more video games. Konami, Sega, and Atari nabbed the rights to produce them after Sunsoft lost their licensing deal, so we were getting these things from all angles, on almost every device. This time on Rank and Review, I'll be listing the Batman Returns games from my least to most favorite, though in this case, I think it's fair to say I'll be placing them from god-awful tests of patience to pretty decent video games. It's the holidays, so grab yourself a spiked eggnog or a mug full of gravy and let's celebrate these interactive experiences based off of Burton's Christmas classic. Well, this isn't a very good game at all. In fact, Batman Returns for the Amiga is one of the worst things I've ever experienced. Man, I had high hopes for this thing too. Ocean Software created some decent games for the kit, starring the Caped Crusader, including the title based off of the first movie. Unfortunately, they weren't offered or interested in returning this time around, so development duties were dropped in the lap of a Liverpool-based company called Denton Designs. These blokes had been around for nearly a decade by this point, creating computer games for the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. It's interesting that at least half of their output in the 80s was actually published by Ocean, which is why I find it so surprising that this game turned out as bad as it did. Denton Designs only lasted another year after this turd dropped in 1993, but they existed for 11 prior. It's astonishing, really, because this game is bad, like really bad. Normally I play through everything I review, but I literally couldn't do it this time. So if that makes my opinion questionable, then skip the video ahead a bit. Basically, you're an adorable little bat sprite, and the objective is to eliminate all of the enemies in an area in order to progress. It sounds simple enough, but everything is so frantic here. Batman has a few moves. He can punch, kick, roll around, and do a leg sweep. The animations are decent, and I like the backgrounds quite a bit. Assets are reused, but the scenery is always changing, which keeps things interesting. At least they are in the first area. All around, the presentation is pretty good. The cutscenes are well done with some nice, colorful details. I didn't get very far, but what I did see followed the beats of the film. At the end of the first stage, your grapple gun becomes available, which allows you to play out the Selina Kyle taser scene from the movie. Good stuff. This could have been a decent game if some time was spent to balance it, or I don't know, give it a playtest. This isn't the first time you're going to hear me complain about difficulty in this video. A lot of these Batman Returns titles suffer from similar issues, but in this Amiga version, the challenge level makes it virtually unplayable. The only way I could seem to advance was to avoid the swarms of spastic enemies for a bit, try to get as many on one side of me as possible, then hunker down and spam the punch attack. Any fancy fighting techniques would result in hit trades or the hemorrhaging of my health bar altogether. It drains really quickly. I was frequently left lying dead on the ground unceremoniously. Batman barely reacts when he's taking damage, which is a bit of a problem, and baddies can stun lock you. It's a goddamned mess. I'm surprised Konami allowed this thing to be sold to the public considering the pedigree of titles they were dropping at the time. This game is an asshole. Just look at these bikers. I had to replay this stage 37 times. I counted. Maybe I'm bad at video games, or maybe this was a product built by boneheads. Why would anyone play this? You can't attack while ducking. I mean, yes, you can do a leg sweep, but it takes too long to perform. Same goes for the batarangs. One would think the best strategy to eliminate projectile shooting adversaries would be to keep some distance and blast back at them. You know, fight fire with fire and all that. Yeah, well, that would be great if the enemies didn't shoot so frequently and fast. You almost need to know what's up ahead, because they'll just blast you until you're dead. Life, point multipliers, ammo, and 1-ups appear after enemy waves, which is good, I guess, but these are small rewards for the chaotic torture you'll be forced to endure. Get used to seeing this groovy dude table game over screen, because there are no continues, and you'll be dying a lot. When Batman perishes, it's back to the beginning. To be fair though, I only completed one level, so maybe there's an item that allows you to restart from the beginning of one of the game's 5 stages, but I wouldn't count on it. Batman is slippery and it takes him a bat minute to turn around, which adds to the issues. You're meant to make some pretty specific jumps here in order to reach enemies perched on higher platforms, but the Caped Crusader controls like he's cracked out on bath salts. I suppose it is a snowy Gotham landscape, but I doubt these asshat developers were consciously attempting to replicate ice physics here. It's a sloppy shit. Denton Designs probably blew their wad acquiring the Batman rights and didn't have enough left over to program a competent game. But that's just speculation. The majority of these titles on this list were crafted in a hurry to coincide with the movie's release. This Amiga version didn't drop until the following year, so it's safe to assume that these developers had a bit more time. For the life of me, I couldn't find a name to attach to the music, though I can't say I really blame the person for not wanting to be associated with this package. The soundtrack isn't even all that bad. When the title screen pops up, it's accompanied by an excellent atmospheric track that suits the tone of the film. Actually, I kinda think it's one of the best pieces in all of these Batman Returns games. The cutscenes also have some good compositions. The tune that plays during the action sequences is, well, it's something. Fucking chaos. Loud, shrill, repetitive. It's enough to stir up an aneurysm, especially when combined with the gameplay. Bombardment. Whew, alright, here we are. I finally beat the first stage. This is a pretty good tune. I can't wait to hear the second area's theme. Surely it can't be as intrusive as nope, same song. My god, what in the hell is going on here, Dad? Just dead. All the way back to the beginning with you. Play through the first level, get to the second one, and... dead again. To hell with this. Sorry people, I tried. It took me hours to be able to reliably get to the second stage, and I can't even get past this first group of enemies. Next! Batman Returns on the Lynx isn't a very good game. Somehow, the Atari Corporation were given the rights to this. The developers had to really rush to get this thing out there, which is painfully obvious. I can't really blame this crew though. They were creating software for the Lynx at nearly an impossible rate to make an impact on the portable market. Atari didn't seem to learn anything from their collapse in the 80s. This was a pretty cool handheld device, but it was loaded with so many underwhelming games. Software so bad that they eventually made this thing the pack-in for the Lynx 2. Cynically speaking, it was probably their last-ditch effort to sell a few more systems before the dark times of the Jaguar. The Batman name alone probably tricked some people, and to all of you out there, I'm sorry. Batman Returns on the Lynx is brief, repetitive, and needlessly difficult. I say needlessly, but we all know why this thing is so tough. They didn't have the time to build a good game, so they made something short and hard, like my manhood, to mask the lack of effort here. It's really quite insulting to assume people wouldn't notice. You're barely in it before the backgrounds start looping, and the game only has 4 stages, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but when they are this repetitive, it comes off as cheap. Batman controls well enough, and the combat is actually somewhat entertaining. There's a weight to his attacks that feels great, but ultimately, it's all pointless because this game doesn't want you to fight anything. Enemies don't stop spawning, and they continuously throw projectiles at Batman. I mean, just look at this. It's a filthy mess. Nope. I'm not dealing with this. Your best option is to just run, jump, and somersault your way through all of the stages. Once I discovered this, there was no reason to stand my ground because, and I can't stress this enough, you will not be able to make any progress if you treat this like a real video game developed by humans. The first stage is colorful, and I suppose the sprites look okay. Batman goes from idle to a full Olympic stride with even the slightest tap in any direction, but it's fine. There's a decent assortment of enemies here, but it doesn't matter because you'll be doing whatever you can to leave them in your bat dust. Interestingly, this stage tries to recreate the destruction of the Max Schreck building from the film. Once you've reached the monument, you're supposed to do what Batman does best: hide behind a mailbox. If you don't do this, you're toast. It's a lame beginner's trap, but at least it's something different. Unfortunately, it's also the one and only somewhat clever gimmick we'll see in the entire game, so drink it in. Then bounce, run, and dodge. All of the things until you've reached the end. Penguin is kinda cool looking, the duck vehicle is vibrant, Batman can do melee attacks, but he also has an arsenal of projectiles, batarangs, test tubes. Wow, okay, so the test tubes. This won't be the last time we see these things. Developers really took that one moment from the film and ran with it. Anyway, just keep plowing ahead, avoiding baddies, and picking up bat icons. The yellow ones refill some of your health, so you're gonna want to beeline it for those. The others give you more ammo, which is less important, but you might as well get your money's worth if you bought this game. The second stage has Batman bouncing across rooftops. This one's a bit more challenging because there are gaps between the buildings, and if you're shot by the authorities, you will seize up in mid-air and plummet like a 27-inch dildo in a Christmas stocking. Oddly specific, but let's roll with it. What these developers lacked in skills, effort, and dignity they made up for with their ability to adapt a complex film into a video game. First, they perfectly represented the cowardice of this character when faced with explosive challenges. They also nailed the beats of the movie with these brilliant abridged level intros. These components don't quite make it a good game, but we're getting close here. Atari were very crunched for time when it came to releasing this thing, mostly due to communication issues they were having with the creators of the film. The gameplay was based off of the Lynx version of Rygar, and they had to come up with a lot of the visuals based off of production stills. Maybe this is why Catwoman has this look going on. It's definitely different, but I can't say I mind. That's right, baby. Stomp on me. Stomp on my bat nuts. Wait, isn't the Joker dead? Nothing matters. Oh, what a clever gift. I just defeated Catwoman and these explosives got me after I had already finished the stage. I'm not upset. No surprise here. It's all just par for the Bat course. Buy Batman Returns for your Atari Lynx today. Let me ask you a question. Do you like this title screen music? It's pretty good, right? Alex Rudis and Robert Vieira did a pretty good job with this theme. Do you like it? You had better love it, because this is all you're getting until the very end of the game, so get it into you. Or just mute it and put on a podcast. I heard VGM 101 did a Batman-themed episode. Might as well listen to that instead. It's a pretty good podcast. The sound effects are loud though, so maybe you won't even notice the single audio track playing over and over. No cutscenes either. No life refills in between stages, and no fun to be had here. Well, I guess it's a bit satisfying to punch penguins in the face if you're a fucking maniac, and you had better become proficient at this, because this is what you get as a boss for the third stage. The Royal Penguin Authority. This was the toughest boss for me, and that's boss with all of the quotes. These little pricks shoot so many rockets from off screen that it can be a real hassle. Luckily, the last stage is quite a bit shorter than the others, at least I think. It's a bit tough to tell when you're not engaging with any of the enemies. I'm almost playing another game entirely here, one where I try not to touch anything but the bat symbols and run my way to the very end. We should call this type of experience a runner. Batman discovers Arctic World. An algorithm seemingly came up with these stage titles, and I've just noticed that I skipped nap time, so let's have ourselves a little sleep with the penguin before we move on. Batman Returns for the Mega Drive Genesis was developed by Malibu Interactive, and it's not a very good video game. I considered placing Batman Returns for the Mega Drive Genesis dead last on this list, with toilets flushing and fart noises to convey my opinions, but that wouldn't have been fair. My personal feelings toward this game are extremely negative, but it's certainly better than the two previous entries on the Lynx and Amiga. My contempt for this thing aside, it still operates like a game, I don't know, closer than those two alternatives at least. If you enjoy this thing and are sensitive to criticism, you're probably going to want to either skip ahead or turn this video off entirely at this point. What I have to say about this game goes beyond a balanced, rational opinion. Playing Batman Returns on the 16-bit Sega machine throws me into fits of rage. A real, immature, visceral reaction where I shout at the screen like a shitty little kid until I wear myself out, get a headache, and need a timeout. I don't often throw the H word out there, but I loathe this thing with every fiber of my being. You've been warned. Here we go. Alright, my personal story with this thing goes back to when I first saw screenshots presented in video game magazines. I'd pore over images until it was released. This was a day one purchase for me. I went to the store, used my own money, and bought it. My goodness gracious lord, I was excited, and then I played it. Batman Returns on the Mega Drive Genesis sounds like shit and plays like shit. I'm not exaggerating for the sake of comedy or being hyperbolic to gain attention. This isn't a shallow, flippant observation. I've tried to break down the metaphorical wall that has divided this thing, and for decades, we're never going to get along because I can't stand it. Batman fumble fucks his way through the stages like a linebacker after a concussive blow. Technically, the controls work, but it always feels like you're working with a character that's a bit spun out, if you know what I mean. It just takes him too long to perform the simplest of tasks. The enemies don't suffer from the same restrictions. They dart around, appear from out of nowhere, and fire projectiles from beyond the boundaries of the screen. Even when I think I have the advantage, the baddies manage to get a few cheap hits in. Trading blows is almost unavoidable, and getting continuously pummeled wears me down. It would be a decent challenge if you could battle it out on the same plane or move around with any urgency, but that's not the case. Aerial foes, traps obscured by the sloppy scenery, projectiles, it's all unpleasant. By the time I notice something, I've already inflicted damage, and most of the areas are filled to the brim with beginner's traps. This brief Ferris wheel sequence is the perfect example of all of this crap in one tiny chunk. How are you supposed to get through this instinctually or skillfully? Simple answer, you can't. You'll need to know this stuff is coming. Same goes for this cathedral section. There are traps, power-ups, and enemies obscured by the foregrounds, while enemies off-screen damage you as soon as you're close. It's bogus, man. 30 years and I still can't reliably take out these basic circus gymnast villains. The darkest of a nearly indiscernible night blends in with all of the other purples, which doesn't help matters much. Everything from the backgrounds to the sprites are different shades of the same color, which makes the entire game feel lifeless and drab. There are glimmers of visual creativity here and there, and a few Batman Returns details peppered throughout, but most of the time the visuals are flat and ugly. Just check out these backgrounds here, or here. How about this parallax scrolling? A nice effect, but the drawings are so plain. The character sprites are a mixed bag as well. Batman and Catwoman look the best in my opinion, but the Penguin sprite leaves something to be desired. Some of the enemies are colorful with decent animations, and the others look basic. When you boot it up, there's a short cutscene that plays out using the in-game engine. There are some admittedly cool transitions showing the Batmobile with the Caped Crusader leaping out before it fades into the action, but that's it. No illustrations, animations, or movie stills to push the narrative along. It's really hard to resent the developers too much though. Konami seemed to have the most pull when it came to assets and information based off of the film, so these folks were probably doing the best they could in a crunch with a limited amount of resources. I'm okay with the absence of the frills, but they could have at least focused their collective efforts into making a decent game. Sunsoft barely had cutscenes in their Batman titles, and they did just fine because they looked, played, and sounded great. This thing, in contrast, is an embarrassment. Batman will need any advantage he can get, which makes his gadgets particularly useful this time around. You've got the Batarang, which is self-explanatory, a smoke bomb to stun enemies. The incredibly powerful but irritatingly situational wire gun that fires a quick white line out in front of the hero to do tons of damage. The giant Batarang hones in on its target, and finally we have the Batman icon itself, which has the Dark Knight spreading his cape in order to unleash a colony of bats. All of these limited power-ups can be cycled through after the start button has been pushed, and it's a nice touch that they are displayed on the utility belt. There are plenty of icons throughout to refill your ammo, as well as 2 different types of hearts for your health, and Batman mirrors for extra lives. Some of these things are even hidden behind foregrounds or in tricky places altogether. It's possible to glide with the assistance of the cape, but for whatever asinine reason, this ability has its own energy bar, which restricts restricts its usefulness. This should have been a skill that could be used at any time. The getting around would have been so much better if they had just allowed the player to soar in short bursts. It's just one more thing to keep track of, and it slows the gameplay down. The rest of the items work as intended, but again, it takes Batman a bit too long to deploy all of them, which brings us to the most frequently used tool in our arsenal, the grapple gun. There's a bit of variety from one stage to the next, with a lot of vertical areas where Batman will need to ascend or descend in order to make progress. The problem is in how long it takes this geriatric purple protagonist to deploy his grapple, but that's what those little blue pills are for. You'll need to wait until he faces skyward while standing still in order to fire his grapple out, which isn't always an option due to the frustrating enemy patterns. It's also possible to attach it to certain objects, and these aren't always discernible from the Barney Barf backgrounds. Swinging around and hooking your way up should be any developer's primary focus when they're creating a Batman title with platforming, but what's here is just such a turnoff. It's clunky, situational, and just plain broken. Nothing about it feels good, and every part of my body gets tense when I have to rely on it. When a life is lost, you'll often respawn immediately where you've perished, which feels like an apology from the creators for making everything so unpleasant to navigate through. These are among the worst grapple mechanics I've experienced, and definitely the most wretched in any Batman game we've looked at so far on this channel. There was seemingly no care put into designing levels that would make swinging around any fun, and when it's required to avoid traps like spikes, it's often a more reasonable solution to just tank the fucking hits in order to move on. This area in the first stage perfectly showcases all of the problems I have with the grapple, but it should also give you an idea of how quickly enemies appear and how close Batman struts to the edge of the screen. Pressing up or down forces the camera to vertically jolt, which would be great if it didn't happen so quickly. If you're on a higher plane and simply want to duck, the entire screen snaps down with you, which can be rather disorienting. Like, were Konami paying these developers off? It's hard to believe anything could be this poorly made on all fronts if it wasn't intentionally sabotaged. Fundamentally, the game is garbage. This was the era of Sega where they started showing their greedy hand. Releasing subpar Western-developed garbage like this didn't make them look good. When people mock the Mega Drive Genesis, it's these types of games they are referring to. Malibu Interactive created this heap, but Sega published it. One of the many mistakes they made in the 90s was allowing stuff like this out the door. They were banking all their money on brand recognition, and the quality of the products just didn't seem to matter. Batman Returns, Jurassic Park, X-Men, different developers, same level of rushed rubbish. This and Western Technology's X-Men share a lot of similarities. They both control like a busted up Dodge in an ice storm and have a lot of the same filthy, ear-bashing sound effects. I'd rather hear just about anything than that enemy death noise, and that low health heartbeat thump can fuck right off. The audio across the board is as dirty as you'd expect from looking at this dreck. Paul Gadebois can be thanked for the music here, which once again only gives 16-bit Sega haters more ammunition to spew undeserved vitriol at the system. Though this is a Sega-published Sega cart playable on a Sega device, so perhaps undeserved is a misnomer. To be fair, there are some decent arrangements here, and the music isn't as offensively gassy as the sound effects, but the chosen instruments start to nag at me after a while. There's an incessant, grating treble tone throughout the majority of the music that wears thin after a few minutes, and the bass has as much heft as a deflated basketball smacking against a concrete court. Genesis Editor for Music and Sound Effects, or GEMS, is the driver to blame here. It was frequently used by Western developers who weren't very familiar with the hardware. Whenever it sounds like your 16-bit Sega is about to croak, it's GEMS. There are moments where you can kind of hear what the artist was trying to do with these compositions, compositions, but unfortunately the melodies are so thin and flaccid, like my manhood, driven by those familiar, muffled bass approximations that sound like they're close to cracking the console's shell into tiny plastic bits. Sometimes it's not entirely the sound driver that is to blame. Take this theme in Shrek's department store, for instance. The melody is fine, but it's a short loop. I don't know, it's hard to explain, but this piece in particular just burrows itself into my brain. When I was recording footage for this review, I honestly let out an audible groan before I decreased the volume. This track just sounds like low-income elevator music performed with muffled car horns. The swelling of that rhythm just drives me nuts. Oh, good. At least I can listen to all of these little ditties in the options. What a relief. 3, 5, or 7 lives. Why wouldn't I go with the maximum amount? The max Shrek amount. The acts are long with multiple stages and bosses in each, so it's wise to go in with as many Batmans as possible. Or is it Batmans? Batmans? Speaking of the big bads, they're all here. Catwoman looks great, but she's a jittery spastic kitty mess. Do you remember the statue from the film? Well, it's in most of these Batman Returns games, but in this version, you get to fight it. Oh, cogs, fireballs, enough is enough. The developers should have just stuck with one or the other and been done with it, but impossible, because more is more. To create something basic would have opened the door for fun. Instead, everything has to be sloppy and quick, like the Penguin. Great! Now where did he go? Why would anyone design a boss like this? And this sequence where you need to work your way down these escalators is as tight as Pfeiffer in latex, only that's a good kind of tight, and this is the bad type of tight. Sloppy slopes, fuck you! This later encounter is all sorts of clumsy. Danny DeVito deserves much better than this. I don't want to dislike the Penguin. He's my favorite Burton-era villain, but look at him. Look at this. Are you seeing it? Fuck me. Yeah, shoot that fiery load. Hit me as soon as I enter the screen and watch as my broken arthritic bat body takes it. Flame on! Flame on! Are these the leprechauns from Looney Tunes? Certainly looks like it. Can I get through a Batman video without mentioning Looney Tunes? Toss it all off. Explode that fire, you lit up twit. Oh. I mean, what can I do about it? I can't do anything about it even if I wanted to. 13 enemies. There are 13 different enemies in this game, and you'll fight them over and over. How did these circus rejects end up in the sewers anyway? Batman Returns, that's why. Batman, nothing matters. Just get it out the door while the movie is still hot, hot, hot. Fire it all over my putrid purple body, you dastardly devil. I've been a bad, bad bat boy. Now punch me in the scrotum and call me useless, because I am. Why doesn't Batman have a jump kick or any reliable means of destroying aerial enemies? There are so many attackers that swoop from above. Couldn't they have allowed me to block at least? How am I to avoid that? Where am I supposed to drop here to prevent taking damage? How am I to know when and where to jump, or what I can grapple on to? Splatterhouse mirror memories? Do I have to start this entire act over from the beginning, you say? There are so many sub-stages and mini-bosses here. Why would I continue to even try? More movie games from Sega. More gems. Did no one learn from Atari in the 80s? More carelessly crafted add-ons. Segway! Oh fuck. It's these guys again. Malibu Interactive also developed a Sega Mega CD Batman Returns game. This one was dumped everywhere in 1993 and features a handful of very long driving stages powered by CD technology. These additions look absolutely incredible, and the vehicles control flawlessly. However, it does share a lot of the same problems as that shoddily crafted Atari Lynx entry. There's barely enough new content here to be a complete package, so you guessed it, they upped the difficulty to an insane degree in order to fool consumers into thinking they were getting a full game. Things start off well enough. As I said, the controls are spot on and the detailed graphics are as spectacular as the effects. The scaling and rotating are top notch here, and it's easy to keep up with the action. Most of the enemies have well telegraphed attacks, and the driving is buttery smooth. I'm not convinced that Spencer Nilsson's score suits the visuals or the tone all of the time, but it's a beautiful soundtrack all around that I listen to frequently outside of the game. The platform stages from the 16-bit version return with brand new CD quality arrangements, which makes it a better game by the tiniest of bits. From the options screen, it is possible to play the driving stages, platforming ones, or both. Basically, the vehicular sequences work as preludes to each of the original game's acts, making this a pretty hearty bat meal. Unlike the Mega Drive Genesis title, there are a few custom-crafted animated bits tossed in here, including an intro where they really enjoy showing us the death of the Ice Princess over and over again. Every time you enter the driving stages, a short video plays out with an approaching Batmobile. I can't get enough of this. It fills me with so much happiness, especially when it zooms in on this angry 90s Tude era Dark Knight with his burning hate-filled eyeballs and clenched bat fists. I love it. There are multiple checkpoints throughout these new levels where you basically need to deplete the red energy meter under Batman's own health bar. Each enemy represents one tick, big or small, and it's up to you to eliminate all of them before the time limit runs out. Ultimately, it's a bit like Outrun, with an emphasis on vehicular destruction rather than driving. Things start off simple enough. There aren't many turns or hills in the first stage, which really helps the player get accustomed to the combat. Instinctively, you may want to hold down on the accelerator, a la Road Rash or other vehicular manslaughter games, but you'll get nowhere fast with that approach. Ideally, you will want to ease up on the gas when you're in a scuffle. Some baddies have short-ranged attacks that will deplete your health in a jiffy, so it's imperative to know when to hang back and fire at them, all while dodging projectiles. There's quite a bit of variety here, and there's a level of tact involved that is rarely seen in these types of games, especially from this era. Each enemy type has a weakness, with some being susceptible to direct damage from your vehicle itself. It would all be rather entertaining if it weren't so damn rigid in design. I think it's safe to say that beginners will have a really tough go accomplishing the objectives within the allotted time. The bosses themselves often took me close to a dozen or so attempts to figure out. Their patterns aren't particularly challenging to memorize, but dealing enough damage on them was consistently a hassle. By stage 2, the terrain gets very hilly and the corners become more treacherous. All of this looks really good in motion, but it's often difficult to inflict substantial damage to your foes. It would have been much easier if the attack button could simply be held down in order to fire, but unfortunately that would have been too forgiving. The weapons will shoot out a handful of rounds when pushed longer, but it eventually sputters out, so you'll need to be a bit of a contortionist with your fingers. When I play, I typically hold my 3-button gamepad like this, because you'll constantly be adjusting the speed of your vehicle as well as firing off projectiles. Missiles are mapped to the extra input, which makes full use of the controller. It doesn't take long to get used to, but I'm old, so my hands tend to cramp up. Is there a wambulance on these roads, or was that only a thing in the ocean game? Those of you who find the turbo tunnel frustratingly exhausting have no idea what you're up against here in these final 2 Batski boat stages. For the most part, the latter half of these CD editions have you avoiding obstacles at breakneck speed against the clock, with little to no wiggle room. These all look very nice, and being able to control another vehicle is cool, even if it is called the Batski boat. These stages give me a massive headache. The end of this game really tires me out, and not in a good, satisfying way. Personally, all of the driving stages overstay their welcome, and the last 2 areas in the boat are exhausting. I think this could have been a terrific addition if the overall difficulty was handled a bit better. There's a decent amount of enemy variety, but the stages go on so long that you'll likely be tired of seeing the same baddies with slight modifications by the 3rd area. These driving sequences have always felt more like a novelty to me than a fully fleshed out game. Yes, the entire 16-bit platformer is included with a fresh new soundtrack, but by the time this was released, I wanted something more. If they had shortened the driving stages, adjusted the difficulty, and recreated the original package from the ground up, this could have been something special. Unfortunately, to me, Batman Returns on the Mega CD feels like 2 products combined to earn a quick buck. That may seem harsh, but I've got to be honest, and I found the added driving sequences to be more frustrating than fun. Spencer Nilsson still rocks, though. Take a seat at your computer, pour a tall pint of whiskey, and take it easy. Batman Returns for DOS is a weird one. Fans of extremely complex point-and-click adventures will probably find it a bit basic, while those who don't care for them at all will likely be turned off entirely. Personally, I enjoy these types of games quite a bit, but have a hard time remaining focused when the clues and puzzles are too abstract or fussy. I imagine this one could get confusing if you haven't seen the film, as the narrative beats follow the latter 3/4 of its plot relatively well. Clearly, I've seen the movie, so I didn't have many problems progressing. Right off the bat, we're introduced to some really nice visuals, including quite a few wonderfully stylized cutscenes. The in-game animations look and feel a bit jerky at times, but never enough to be distracting. As Batman, you'll be tasked with parsing clues found throughout Gotham over the course of 9 days. The Batcave fittingly acts as your command center. It's here where you'll be able to input, analyze, and extrapolate all of the clues found in the city. Once you feel satisfied with your night's work, you can manually retire to Wayne Manor, which triggers a new day. News broadcasts can be viewed from the cave or while driving around in the Batmobile. These offer up hints to guide you to the next objective. Most of these clues are spelled out, but occasionally you'll need to use the old noggin, or explore some of the more crime-ridden hotspots. Luckily, the searchable areas aren't very large, and you'll have from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. to roam around, which is more than a generous amount of time. All of the areas are very well detailed, and I absolutely love how they decided to present everything. The art successfully blends that classic hand-drawn comic book aesthetic with Burton's darker Batman style. I'm particularly fond of the vistas presented from the rooftops. There's a warmth to the color scheme that suits the detailed environments. The noir elements of the film are accentuated by this creative art style, and the fact that you're bouncing around looking for clues adds a layer of pulp to the experience. There are discoverable videotapes among the clues that include the majority of the movie's main cast, so Bat fans have a bit to sink their teeth into. Unfortunately, there's a strict limit to what you can actually do, which makes the overall package feel quite lean. As you feed more information to your computer and interrogate your way through the streets of Gotham, new explorable areas open up. Driving to a new landmark is always exciting for the first time, but my interests started to wane pretty early in the game. By the third day, you'll have likely seen all of the environments. New situations will still occur in these same locations at specific times of night, but they all take place in the same handful of areas. The fish market, zoo, and mayor's office get reused a lot. The latter two are hotbeds for clues, and the fish guy is a rat who feeds Batman a ton of information, so you're going to want to revisit these joints almost daily. I do question the intelligence of the mayor though. I'm straight up lifting anything I can get my hands on nightly, and he just keeps laying it all out. Incriminating videotapes, pictures, hard evidence. You'd think he'd start to notice, but nope. There are a few action scenes, but they're nothing special. Batman reacts to commands that you input on his utility belt. All of the characters dance around like they're on quaaludes in between attacks. I'm not sure if it's lag or an intentional mechanic, but it can take a few moments before anyone does anything on screen. For what it's worth, I've never lost a fight, but I've definitely taken some bat damage. There's a vault in the Batcave where you can swap out suits when your offensive and defensive stats get too low. This is also the place to stock up on items and gadgets. I was able to get the best ending loading myself up to the tits with projectile weapons and going full Batfleck, but there are a few passive tools like lockpicks available if you want to be a true detective. The final stretch of the game follows the movie to a T, with long cutscenes and one clever trick in particular that can be pulled off using the computer's video transmitter. I'm sure you can all guess what it is, but I still don't want to spoil anything because this is a worthwhile adventure to experience for yourself. I will say that the Batski boat does replace the Batmobile at some point, and it looks awesome, despite the silly name. Batman Returns is an easy DOS game to get into. Newcomers to the point-and-click genre should have no problems adjusting to the mechanics. Those of you who have seen the movie won't have much trouble achieving the good ending after an hour or so, but there are multiple conclusions depending on the choices made throughout. Some are rather surprising. Park Place and Spirit of Discovery did their homework here. Konami published it, and they had more rights to the film, so it sticks very close to its source material. The fighting is a bit clunky, but the visuals, sound effects, and music are all well done. I definitely recommend this Batman Returns adventure game. It looks like we're finally moving forward to the better titles. Yo-oh, another Batman Returns game published by Sega, only this one was developed by Aspect, the same company responsible for Sonic 2 on the Master System and the wonderfully mediocre Axe Battler Golden Axe spin-off for the Game Gear, which we've already reviewed. This Batman game was also never released in North America, and it doesn't suck. It's actually quite good. So this 8-bit Sega title dropped in 1993 and plays very similarly to a handheld entry we'll be exploring a bit later in this video. In this one, our petite purple protagonist gets around by running, jumping, and using the grapple. Swinging around is a big deal here, as all of the stages can be explored vertically as well as horizontally. It takes a few moments to get used to the mechanics, but once you've gotten the hang of them, the game is a lot of fun. The controls are extremely tight and responsive, but they kinda have to be because Batman goes down after one hit. It's all good though, everything is designed with this shinobi-like system in mind. Baddies and traps are well placed and never feel cheap. The Caped Crusader respawns quickly wherever he perishes, but his weapons do get downgraded as a result, which is a fair trade-off. Batarangs are your primary means of attack, and they can be upgraded by collecting bat symbols. These are placed everywhere to add to the strength, speed, and distance of your projectiles. Other bat symbols give your hero an extra life, and the game is just as generous with placing these throughout the stages. There aren't any cutscenes or story beats to push you along, and the game is relatively short with only 5 areas to explore. However, the first 4 acts have 2 routes to choose from. The second path is always the harder one, with slightly tougher enemy arrangements and far more death pits. The differences aren't that noticeable beyond the difficulty, but it's a nice addition that encourages players to replay through the game in different ways. If you're new to this title, I'd encourage the easier route first. There's some tricky platforming towards the latter half of that path, so by the end you should be ready to take on the tougher grapples in the other. The biggest hurdle for me was learning how to make deliberate, meaningful jumps. When you leap into a swing, Batman will remain facing the direction he deployed his grapple, so it's imperative to plan out which way you'll want to go before you commit. It adds a level of strategy to the gameplay that I really enjoy. There are bosses at the end of each stage, but unfortunately they are the same regardless of which direction you decide to take. Most of them have plain black backgrounds, which is kind of a shame, but the duels with Catwoman have interesting backdrops. These skirmishes with the lovely latex lady are pretty fun, but they're also extremely easy. The same can be said for all of the big bads and the entire game, really. I've gotta say, I enjoyed replaying this thing after the others on this list, and it's one I frequently revisit because of its casual level of challenge. It's a tight package and a blast to play through. In a lot of ways, it pales in comparison to its portable brethren, but we'll get there soon enough. If you haven't played Batman Returns for the Master System, I highly recommend giving it a shot. A boxed copy is still relatively inexpensive if you have the means to play it. Batman Returns on the NES was developed and released by Konami in 1993. It's an often overlooked entry starring the Caped Crusader that plays a lot like the 2 Ninja Turtles beat-em-ups on the console. Now, I'm going to admit something that most of you might consider shameful, but I've never really cared for Turtles 2, the arcade game. I find it mind-numbing, repetitive, and bland. The arcade original is great, and the Manhattan Project improved on some things, but I'll take the original 8-bit Ultra entry all day before the second. I say this because Batman Returns suffers from a lot of the same issues as that Turtles home port. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, actually it's quite good considering the limitations of the hardware. The controls are tight and responsive. Batman has some basic melee moves, an aerial kick, a strong cape attack that depletes a bit of health, and an extremely useful slide maneuver that frequently comes in handy. He can also block by holding down and B, but it rarely works against against enemy attacks. Tapping select cycles through Batman's weapons and gadgets, but the projectiles such as batarangs aren't all that useful since you'll need to be standing still to deploy them. The grapple gun, however, is pretty useful all around. It can take out aerial enemies as well as launch you up to higher platforms. Items and power-ups can also be smacked down with the grapple, which makes it the most useful gadget in Batman's belt. You have an enormous health bar here, but you only start the game out with 1 life. Boxes can be earned throughout the stages that operate similarly to the energy tanks from Metroid. Health replenishing hearts can be found all over the place, and once your active bar is full, the remaining energy will go straight into your box. Box. Passwords are a thing which is kind of useful considering the length of the stages. These put you back to the first act of an area. This can be a pretty challenging game, so it's nice to have the freedom to practice the trickier levels without being forced to replay through all of the stages. Backgrounds are well drawn and the environments stay true to the source material. There are plenty of cutscenes that represent the movie quite well, both in and out of gameplay. A lot of the dialogue appears to have been written by space aliens, which is always good for a laugh. There are also multiple endings, but it can be a real chore to see all of them. You'll need to jump through some pretty strange hoops in order to see everything, but either way, it's nice to know that some care was put into the production, especially after the lackluster efforts we've seen before. Maybe Batman is crying blood during these game narrative sequences because he spent his day playing the Sega game. The characters are detailed and look good in motion, but I'm not sure how much I like the limited amount of colors used on the sprites. I'm aware that this is a result of the NES's limited palette, but I would have preferred less detailed environments over bland characters, but that's just a nitpick. Boss battles are quite dynamic, most of them are recognizable from the film and have multiple attack patterns to learn. It's imperative to do well against them since Batman's life bar doesn't refill itself between stages, which feels unnecessarily cruel. Occasionally, you'll get to move around on a 2D plane, similarly to its SNES counterpart, which shakes things up a bit. I really enjoy this touch because the standard combat can get quite monotonous after a while, especially since enemies attack in waves of 2 or 3 at a time, and for the majority of the game they appear in groups of the same type. My biggest complaints are that some of the levels go on far too long and there isn't a ton of variety when it comes to baddie designs. The developers did an excellent job tossing in clever obstacles and traps to keep things fresh at first, but the final quarter lacks anything new, at least when it comes to the brawler stages. This thing is front-loaded with interesting ideas and culminates in an excellent Batman chase before it starts to devolve into an excessively challenging, repetitive gauntlet. Oh, and these big bouncy clowns can piss right off. They're so erratic and it can be very challenging to do damage to them without taking a few hits yourself. Some of the areas feature light platforming, slippery rooftops, and icy grounds. It may not sound like much, but these details break up the mindless monotony of bashing the same groups of baddies over and over. The Batmobile sequence is just a blast, and these crazy little dudes who fly out of their cars to attach themselves to yours never gets old. They look so goofy. Also, kudos to the developers for including the Bat missile in this game. Bad ass. You'll also get to captain the most ridiculously named vehicle of all time in a tunnel. This is more of a bonus round to accumulate bat points, but it's certainly a good break from the arduous action between the final 2 stages. Takashi Takeishi composed the soundtrack, which is probably why your ears are hearing Mega Man right now. From what I can tell, this was his first soundtrack created for Konami after his departure from Capcom. Unsurprisingly, it's great stuff, and I really enjoy the catchy harmonies. They don't necessarily capture the moody tone of the film, but I dig all of the pieces and how they unapologetically sound like video game music. This composer would remain with Konami for a while after this, and returned to compose the score for Batman the Animated Series on the Game Boy. Really not a whole lot more to say about this thing. It's a competently crafted Konami beat-em-up, with just enough variety to not get overly stale. It still suffers from the same trappings of all beat-em-ups, but this is one of the better ones for the NES. OGGG Batman Returns game by Aspect. This handheld title was released almost everywhere in 1992. It is by far the superior version, with bright, well-drawn cutscenes, a life bar, and a more engaging level of challenge. We have one more entry to tackle on this list, but if I'm being completely honest, this is my go-to Batman Returns game. But more on that later. Motohiro Kawashima composed the soundtracks for both of these 8-bit Sega entries with assistance from Yuzo Koshiro. Interestingly, it was Koshiro who also did the music for the Game Gear's unique Sonic the Hedgehog entry. He and Kawashima would frequently collaborate on other soundtracks, most notably the second and third Streets of Rage titles on the Mega Drive Genesis. The music in this and the Master System version are excellent, despite the inherent audio limitations. All of the melodies are catchy with that quality Kawashima flair. It's indisputably a soundtrack crafted by these two incredibly talented musicians and will be immediately recognizable by their fans. I don't know what it is, but the tiny little ditty that plays out after every stage tickles all of my pleasure centers. And this Too Many Cooks prototype piece never gets old. Batman controls the same as he does in the console version, and the stages follow the same themes. The option to choose from two different paths is also present here. All in all, this original version is very similar to the port that would come after, but enemies and obstacles are often in different places. In this one, baddies take more than one hit to dispose of, but so does Batman. Both the enemies and bosses are far more aggressive here, which makes the combat feel rewarding. When it came to the Master System, they would go down easily, but here the big bads have a few tricks up their sleeves and slightly alter their attack patterns. It's also nice to see a bit of a background going on in these combat arenas. They could have been better and might give you a headache or a seizure, but it's something. The two Catwoman fights are a lot of fun. She has great attacks to dodge, and it's so satisfying to learn her movesets. She switches things up a bit during the second encounter, but there's only one addition to her pattern. It would have been nice if they had included a bit more, but these fights are still easily my favorite across all of the games on this list. Right, so the differences, well, as I said, Batman has a health bar, but he can now swap between 3 Batarang modes on the fly and call for a limited amount of Batmobile screen nukes, not unlike Streets of Rage. The Batmobile gets swapped out for the Batski boat at one point. What a horrible name for a vehicle. Your Batarang projectiles range from short to long distances, with the former having the strongest attack and the latter the weakest. This adds a layer of complexity to the combat that didn't get transferred over to the Master System version. I find it most useful to take advantage of the weaker, further spread of one option while making my way through the stages, but typically switch it out to the stronger, shorter variant for tougher enemies and bosses. When I can't decide, I opt for the mid-range alternative, which is the most balanced overall. Losing a life will, once again, reset your bat skills back to square one, but the stages all have plenty of hearts to keep your Crusader nice and healthy. In the Master System version, Batman can grapple onto something and get his swing on from an idle dangle. Here, you'll need to come at things from an angle in order to swing, which feels a bit more like Bionic Commando. I'm a fan of both flavors because they encourage a different gameplay style, but if I had to pick one, I'd go with this. It's a bit more rigid, but the inputs are snappy, and traversing this way is quicker, more exciting. One issue I have is that the enemies will track your movements if they're on a platform above, which can often lead to some problems. It doesn't happen frequently enough to be a huge nuisance, but occasionally you'll get knocked back when grappling up because a baddie refuses to move. There's also one specific area where one of them locks onto you a little too well while you're trying to swoop across a particularly challenging chasm. Again, these are rare occurrences, so they are easy to ignore. It's good to see the architect from the '89 Mega Drive Genesis game was still working hard, designing bottomless pits in this Gotham. Batman has a glide in both this and the Master System port, and it can be used at any time. These developers knew how to program a game. You can safely swoop down anywhere whenever you want, but it only lasts so long. Wow, incredible. Making games fun is incredible. Why are the penguins so depressed? Maybe they watched the Lynx gameplay where I punched them all in the head. It is the only title on this list where abusing animals is encouraged. Gotta love Atari. Overall, this is a solid, inexpensive game to add to your portable Sega collection. It's pretty short, but it's great, like my manhood. I'm not sure why they omitted stuff when it came to porting this over to the Master System. The colorful, well-drawn cutscenes, life bar, and ability to swap out weapons on the fly are all good things. Clearly, I prefer this Game Gear version, but you really can't go wrong with either 8-bit Batman Returns games for Sega devices. Batman Returns for the Super Nintendo is a beautiful looking, licensed game. This is a case of presentation winning out. If I'm being honest, I'd rather play the previous entry on the Game Gear, but there's no denying that Batman Returns on the Super Nintendo is the most faithful experience based off of the film. All of the cutscenes are gorgeous. They're edited very well and capture the feel of the movie perfectly. The way characters slide into frame adds excitement to the stills, and it's clear the crew over at Konami took a lot of pride in this product. The environments feel like they were ripped straight from the film with a stylized Burton look and enough landmarks to make you believe you're in Gotham. All of the enemies are as well drawn as the rest, and instantly recognizable from the movie. The animations are equally as impressive with their weighty movements and interesting character quirks. Sometimes the baddies will be actively up to something before Batman's presence is known. Tormenting citizens, destroying property, reading a newspaper. There's a lot of detail in the simplest of things, and I'm a big fan of how the enemies can damage each other in the throes of battle. I dig this in any game, but there's a hefty oomph to the hits here that makes it especially delicious. Batman can do all of the basic bat things when it comes to melee combat, as well as block, and it's actually useful this time around. On top of that, he has a special attack similar to the NES version that also uses up some health. Test tubes can be dropped to clear the screen, and gadgets such as the batarang or grapple can be used at any time. Occasionally, the game will switch to a 2D plane, again, very much like the 8-bit Nintendo alternative, only here it forces you to rely solely on projectiles. This is my favorite inclusion as it breaks up the monotonous grind of bashing baddies. These are the stages where you'll use the grapple to platform. Admittedly, this feels about as clunky and silly as it looks, but at least they tried to incorporate all of Batman's traits into one package. Unfortunately, all of these 2D sequences are short, with a linear structure, and the cleverer bits are mostly showcased in the front half. The final areas do have some interesting visuals with great effects, but I tend to find that the game drags after the Batmobile sequence, which isn't very good to begin with. Outside of the amazing graphics, this driving stage falls a bit flat. I'm glad they included another break from the repetition, but there's not much gameplay here. It's an SNES effects showcase, which isn't inherently bad, but it's just a bit too shallow for me. This isn't an easy beat-em-up, and button mashing will get you nowhere. I'm glad some thought went into the combat, and the tiny perks like smashing enemies into the various backgrounds never gets old. That being said, I do find the boss battles a tad too punishing, and the last stage is a frustrating gauntlet. These penguins look fantastic, but their projectiles can be a real problem. It's as if the development team ran out of gas when they designed this area. The game kicks off with so many clever ideas, but by the end it devolves into a typical brawler. It's not bad, but I do find myself getting very frustrated playing through it. Funahashi, Harumi Ueko, and Kazuhiko Uehara composed the soundtrack, and it perfectly emulates Danny Elfman's cinematic score. The music accompanies the cutscenes and gameplay superbly, which makes this feel more like a Batman Returns experience. At the time, I had not played any adaptations on home consoles that felt this authentic. In a lot of ways, it transcended the limitations of the video game genre back in the day for me. I had a close friend in high school who was as big a Batman fan as I, and we would frequently pop this cart into his Super Nintendo just to marvel at the presentation. It's a bit of a bummer we couldn't enjoy it cooperatively, because that's the best way to experience a brawler, but I'm not even sure how they could have added a second player. Maybe Alfred could have fashioned a suit of armor from Kitchen Hardware, or perhaps Marlon Wayans could have donned the Robin suit, as Burton intended. Either way, the game looked good then, and still holds up now. At the end of the day, there's no doubt in my mind that the SNES Batman Returns game is the best. Personally, I find the final stage and some of the bosses a bit off-putting, but that's just me. Most days I tend to prefer playing the Game Gear entry because I enjoy the platforming action, but the 16-bit Super Nintendo definitely has everything else beat when it comes to that true Batman Returns experience. Next time on this channel, something completely different. So happy holidays and stay tuned.